I was 56 when I found out my wife, Helen, was cheating on me. After 32 years of marriage, 3 kids, and what I thought was a rock-solid relationship, I discovered a betrayal I never saw coming. But here's the thing. It wasn't with the local mechanic, a gym trainer, or some faceless online stranger. No, it was with a man who hadn't set foot on this earth in 20 years. Her first husband, Roger. Let me explain before you think I've lost my mind. It all started when Helen, my loving wife of over 3 decades, became obsessed with sorting through old boxes in our attic. We had moved into this house shortly after we got married, and like most couples, we'd shoved things up there over the years, old clothes, kids' toys, and those miscellaneous items you never have the heart to throw away. Helen, always sentimental, had a soft spot for old letters, mementos, and photographs. At first, I didn't think much of it. She'd been retired for a year now, and I figured she was just passing the time. But then it started happening more frequently. She'd disappear for hours, coming down with dusty boxes and a far-off look in her eyes. She'd say things like, "Do you remember when we took that trip to Niagara Falls?" Or, "Did I ever tell you about the time Roger and I got lost in the woods during a hike?" Roger was her first husband. She had married him when she was barely out of college, long before I came into the picture. He died in a car accident in 1991, just a few months before I met Helen. It was one of those tragedies you hear about, and while I knew she had loved him, we never talked about him much. I respected her past, and she respected that I didn't want to dig into it. But now, after all these years, Roger was resurfacing in strange ways. Helen started bringing him up in conversation more and more, reminiscing about their life together in a way that made me feel like I was standing in someone else's shadow. She'd mentioned little details about their marriage I had never heard before, and every time she did, it felt like a small pinprick to my heart. I tried to ignore it, but it gnawed at me. One evening, after Helen had spent most of the day rummaging through old boxes, she came downstairs holding a worn-out journal. I recognized it immediately. It was her old diary from when she was younger. She had kept it locked away for years, and I had never once asked to read it. It wasn't my place, and honestly, I didn't want to pry into the parts of her life that didn't involve me. She sat down next to me, flipping through the pages with a nostalgic smile on her face. "I haven't read this in years," she said, her voice soft, almost as if she was talking to herself. I nodded, not really sure what to say. I didn't want to intrude on her memories, but the tension in the room felt palpable. She was lost in that journal, in those memories, and I was starting to feel like a ghost in my own marriage. "I was so in love with him, she said suddenly, glancing up at me. Roger was everything to me back then. I stiffened at her words, trying to hide the jealousy that was creeping up inside me. I knew I shouldn't feel that way. Roger was long gone, and I had been the one by her side for all these years. But still, something about the way she said it made me I know, I replied, keeping my voice calm. "You've mentioned him a lot lately." She looked at me for a moment, her eyes searching mine as if she was deciding whether to say something else. Then, with a deep breath, she closed the journal and set it aside. "I think I need to tell you something," she said quietly. And that's when everything changed. Helen's words hung in the air, thick with meaning I couldn't yet grasp. I studied her face, searching for clues, but there was nothing in her expression that prepared me for what was coming. "What is it?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice wavered slightly. Deep down, I already knew this wasn't going to be just another nostalgic memory. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the journal, and for a moment I thought she might change her mind. But then she looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Guilt. Deep, raw guilt. "I've been writing to him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. My mind went blank. Writing to him? Roger, the man who had been dead for nearly 20 years? I wasn't sure I heard her right, but the way she said it, with such quiet conviction, made me realize she wasn't talking about something in the past. This wasn't just about reliving old memories. "I don't understand," I said slowly, leaning forward. "Writing to who?" "Roger," she repeated, her hands trembling slightly. "I've been writing him letters for years, ever since the accident." It felt like the room shifted, tilting sideways under the weight of her confession. I couldn't speak, I couldn't think. My first instinct was to laugh it off. Surely this was some kind of odd coping mechanism, a way for her to process her grief. But there was something in her tone, something darker, that made my chest tighten. "For years?" I finally managed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Helen, what are you talking about? He's gone." "I know," she said quickly, her words tumbling over themselves. "I know that. I do. But when he died, I didn't know how to cope. It was like a part of me went with him, and I couldn't let go. So I started writing him letters, telling him about my day, about things I wished I could share with him. It was comforting in a way. I sat back, absorbing her words. The idea of her writing letters to her dead husband wasn't something I could easily wrap my head around, but grief does strange things to people. Still, the way she was looking at me told me there was more to the story. So, what now? I asked, trying to sound understanding but feeling my patience wear thin. Are you saying you've been doing this for 30 years? Helen looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring absently. I stopped for a while after we got married. I thought I had moved on. But then a few years ago, I found myself thinking about him more and more, especially after the kids left the house and we settled into our routine. I felt empty. I felt a pang of something in my chest. Was it anger? Hurt? I wasn't sure. But hearing her talk about feeling empty made my stomach twist. Had I been so blind all these years, thinking everything between us was fine while she was secretly pining for a man who was long dead? So, what, you just picked up where you left off? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. Helen winced. I started writing again. Yes. At first, it was just a few letters here and there. But lately, it's been more frequent. I thought it would help me process things, but instead, it's made me realize something. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever she was about to say, I knew it was going to change everything. I think I'm still in love with him, she said, her voice breaking. Even after all this time, the words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. In love with him? After 30 years of marriage, raising kids, building a life together, how could she say that? You're still in love with a ghost? I asked, my voice incredulous. Helen, do you hear yourself? I know it sounds crazy, she said, tears welling up in her eyes. But it's how I feel, and I've been trying to fight it. I love you too, Jack. But this thing with Roger, it never went away. I buried it for years, and now it's all coming back. I stood up, pacing the room, my mind racing. I didn't know what to say. How do you compete with a memory? How do you process the fact that your wife is still emotionally tied to someone who's been dead for 2 decades? It felt like I was losing her to a man who didn't even exist anymore. So what does this mean? I finally asked, turning to face her. What are you saying? That you wish you were still with him? Helen didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down, her shoulders slumping. I don't know what I'm saying. I needed to tell you. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I feel like I've been living 2 lives, one with you and one in my mind with him. The silence in the room was deafening. I wanted to yell, to throw something, to demand answers that would make this whole thing make sense. But the truth was, there were no answers. Helen had been living with this secret for years, and now that it was out, I didn't know how to feel. I didn't know if I could even look at her the same way. I turned to leave the room, needing space, needing air, but before I walked out, I asked one last question, one that had been nagging at me since she first started talking. Have you been writing to him while you were with me? Helen's eyes met mine, and her silence was all the confirmation I needed. I walked out without another word. I walked out of the house that night without a plan, just the need to get as far away from it as possible. The crisp evening air hit my face, but it didn't cool the firestorm of emotions raging inside me. Helen's confession spun in my head like a bad dream, one I couldn't wake up from. The streets were quiet, and I found myself wandering aimlessly through the neighborhood, passing familiar houses that suddenly felt foreign. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the road, and I kept walking, trying to make sense of what Helen had told me. 32 years of marriage, 3 kids, a life we'd built together, and all that time, she'd been holding on to someone else. To a man who had been dead for over 2 decades, still in love with him. The words echoed in my mind, and each time they cut a little deeper. I ended up at a small park down the road, the same park where I used to take the kids when they were young. I sat down on one of the benches, staring at the empty swing set, the memories flooding back. Helen and I pushing the kids on the swings, laughing as they giggled, the world feeling so full of possibility back then. What had happened to us? I pulled out my phone and stared at it for a long time, debating whether to call someone. But who? Our kids? They didn't need to hear this mess. My friends? I hadn't talked to them about anything real in years. We had all drifted apart after retirement, caught up in our own routines. And honestly, how do you even begin a conversation like this? Hey, my wife's still in love with her dead husband. What should I do? I put the phone back in my pocket and leaned back on the bench, closing my eyes. Maybe if I sat here long enough, the weight of it all would fade, and I'd be able to think clearly. But no matter how long I sat there, the same questions kept gnawing at me. What now? What am I supposed to do with this? By the time I got home, it was late. The house was dark, and I figured Helen had gone to bed. Part of me was relieved. I didn't know if I was ready to talk to her yet. How do you even begin to confront something like this? I tiptoed inside, trying to keep quiet, but I noticed a light on in the kitchen. Helen was sitting at the table, nursing a cup of tea, her eyes red from crying. She looked up when I walked in, and for a moment we just stared at each other, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between us filling the room. "You didn't have to leave," she said softly, breaking the silence. "I didn't know what else to do," I replied, my voice heavy with exhaustion. She nodded, and for a moment we just stood there, two people who had shared a lifetime together but suddenly felt like strangers. The kitchen felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, and I could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Finally, I sat down across from her, staring at the tea in her hands. "Helen, I don't understand any of this. Writing to Roger? After all these years?" "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "It doesn't make sense, even to me, but I've been carrying it for so long. I didn't know how to let it go. Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my frustration seeping into my words. "You've been writing to him for years, while we've been together, and you never thought to mention it." Tears welled up in her eyes again. "Because I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't want to hurt you, and I thought it would just stay in the past, that I could move on with you. And for a while I did. But then I started feeling like something was missing." "Missing?" I repeated, my voice rising. "We've been married for 32 years, Helen. We raised a family together. What was missing?" Her eyes darted down to the table, and she whispered, "I don't know, I just never let him go." A cold silence fell between us. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. We had built a life together, shared everything, and yet all this time, she had been holding on to a man who had been gone for decades. How do you compete with a memory? How do you live with someone who's in love with the past? "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice quiet now. "Do you want to be with him? With a ghost? I mean, what does this even mean for us?" Helen looked up at me, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I don't know, Jack. I don't know what I want. I love you, I do, but it's like I've been living two lives. One with you, and one where Roger still exists." The frustration in me boiled over. "Helen, he doesn't exist anymore. He's gone. And you're here, with me. Why is that not enough?" She flinched at my words, and I immediately regretted the harshness of them, but I couldn't help it. I felt like I was competing with someone who wasn't even alive. How was I supposed to fight for our marriage when her heart was split between two men, one who was still here and one who wasn't? "I wish I had the answers," she said, her voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you, Jack. I've been so lost, I didn't even realize how deep I had fallen into this. I just wanted to hold on to something that made me feel alive again." "Alive?" I echoed, shaking my head. "How do I fit into that, Helen? I've been here with you through all of it. And you're telling me you're still holding on to him?" She wiped away a tear, her hand shaking. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Jack, but I'm asking for it anyway. I don't want to lose you. I don't." I stared at her, the woman I had spent more than half my life with, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if we could find our way back from this. The betrayal wasn't just about a physical affair. It was emotional, and it ran deep. She had kept a part of herself locked away for decades, and now that I knew the truth, I wasn't sure if I could be enough for her. "I need time," I said finally, standing up from the table. "I need to think." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks as I walked away, leaving her alone in the kitchen. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had fundamentally shifted, and I wasn't sure if we could ever put it back together. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind swirling with everything Helen had told me. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards as Helen moved around downstairs, probably cleaning up the tea or pacing the kitchen. The stillness of the night felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of her confession. I kept trying to wrap my head around it. This idea that my wife had been living two lives, emotionally tied to a man who had been dead for decades. I had known she loved Roger, of course. He was her first husband, the man she lost so tragically before we met. But I had always assumed that what we built together over the last 32 years had filled whatever void his death had left in her heart. I never imagined I was sharing her with his ghost. The idea that she had been writing to him all this time, pouring out her thoughts and feelings, while I had been in the dark, gnawed at me. It was a betrayal unlike anything I had ever experienced. Not a physical one, but something deeper, more painful. She had given a part of herself to someone I could never compete with, and what was worse, she didn't even know if she could let him go. As the hours ticked by, I kept thinking about what she said, about how she still loved me. But was it possible to love two people at the same time? Could she truly love me while still holding on to Roger in that way? And if she couldn't let go of him, where did that leave us? When the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I knew I needed to get out of the house. I couldn't sit there any longer, trapped in my thoughts, with Helen just a few feet away, knowing we'd have to face each other sooner or later. I needed space, a chance to clear my head and figure out what the hell I was going to do next. Quietly, I slipped out of bed and got dressed, grabbing my keys and heading for the door. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw Helen asleep on the couch, her face tear-streaked, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold the pieces of her life together. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy, but then the hurt resurfaced and I pushed it aside. I needed to be alone. I drove aimlessly for a while, the early morning streets still quiet, the world just starting to wake up. I ended up at the pier, the place I always went when I needed to think. The water was calm, the boats bobbing gently in the harbor, and the air was filled with that familiar smell of salt and seaweed. I sat on one of the old wooden benches overlooking the water, letting the cool breeze wash over me. For a while, I just sat there, watching the waves lap against the dock, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to answer. Was this the end of my marriage? Could I move past this? Could Helen? I pulled out my phone, scrolling aimlessly through my contacts. I wasn't sure who I was looking for. Maybe one of the kids or an old friend. I thought about calling our oldest son Daniel, but what would I even say? Hey, guess what? Your mom's been emotionally cheating on me with her dead husband for years, and I don't know what to do about it. No, I couldn't drag the kids into this. Not yet. Instead, I found myself dialing someone else. Linda. Linda was my sister, a couple of years younger than me. We had always been close, though our lives had drifted a bit in recent years. She was living across town with her husband, retired, and enjoying a slower pace of life. We didn't talk as often as we used to, but if there was anyone who could make sense of this, it was her. After a few rings, she picked up. Hey, Jack, she said, her voice still groggy from sleep. What's going on? You're calling pretty early. Sorry, I muttered, realizing how early it still was. I needed to talk to someone. Everything okay? She asked, immediately sensing the tension in my voice. I hesitated, unsure of how to even begin. No, not really. There was a long pause on her end before she spoke again, her voice softer this time. What's going on? I took a deep breath, then launched into the whole story. Helen, the letters, her confession about still being in love with Roger. I didn't leave anything out. It all spilled out of me like a dam that had finally burst, all the frustration, confusion, and hurt I had been bottling up since the night before. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end. I could almost picture Linda, sitting there in her kitchen with a cup of coffee, trying to process everything I had just dumped on her. Wow, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't even know what to say, Jack. Yeah, I replied, rubbing my temples. That makes two of us. I mean, writing to Roger all these years? That's heavy, she said, still trying to wrap her head around it. But do you think it's just some kind of coping thing? Maybe she never fully dealt with his death? I don't know, I said, frustration creeping back into my voice. Maybe it started that way, but she's still doing it. She admitted she's still in love with him. What does that even mean for us? Linda sighed. I don't know, Jack, but I do know one thing. You've got to talk to her about this, really talk to her. Not just about the letters, but about everything. Where her head's at, where your marriage is at. This isn't something you can just ignore. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I knew she was right. As much as I wanted to avoid another confrontation, I couldn't pretend this wasn't happening. If I had any hope of saving my marriage, I needed to understand what was going on in Helen's mind. I guess you're right, I said, my voice heavy with resignation. But I don't know if I can handle hearing any more of it. You're stronger than you think, Linda said gently. Look, just take it one step at a time. You've been through a lot with Helen. Don't throw it all away without trying to figure this out. You owe it to yourself and to her. We talked a little while longer, and by the time I hung up, I felt a little better. Not much, but enough to face what needed to be done. Linda was right. No matter how much this hurt, I couldn't just walk away without understanding where things really stood. I'd spent over 3 decades with Helen, and I wasn't ready to give up on us just yet. When I got back home, the sun was higher in the sky, and the house was quiet. Helen was still asleep on the couch, curled up in the same position as when I left. I stood there for a moment watching her. She looked so small, so fragile, and for the first time in a long while, I saw her not as the woman who had betrayed me, but as someone who was hurting too. Maybe Linda was right. Maybe this wasn't just about Roger. Maybe it was about something deeper, something that neither of us had dealt with in years. I sat down across from Helen and waited for her to wake up. I knew the conversation ahead wouldn't be easy, but if we were going to have any chance at all, it was time to lay everything on the table. Helen stirred on the couch, slowly coming out of her fitful sleep. I watched as her eyes fluttered open, taking a moment to focus on me sitting across from her. She blinked a few times, disoriented, and then the reality of the situation seemed to crash down on her face all at once. "Jack," she started, sitting up, her voice hoarse from crying. "You're back." "I never really left," I replied quietly. "I needed some time to think." She nodded, brushing her hair back, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The silence between us felt heavier than it had ever been before. It wasn't just about the letters or her feelings for Roger anymore. It was about everything. Every unspoken thought, every unresolved issue in our marriage. Everything that had been left unsaid over the years was bubbling just beneath the surface. And we both knew it. Finally, I broke the silence. "Helen, we need to talk. Not just about last night, but about everything. I can't keep pretending this isn't happening." She looked down, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "I know. I don't even know where to begin." "Well, start with the truth," I said, my voice firmer now. "What's really going on? This can't just be about Roger. It's got to be more than that." Helen closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. When she opened them again, they were filled with a mix of sadness and resignation. "You're right," she said softly. "It's not just about Roger. It hasn't been for a long time." She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "When Roger died, I was devastated. It was like my whole world collapsed, and I didn't know how to put the pieces back together. I grieved for him, but then I met you, and for a while, I thought I had moved on. I thought I had found a new life with you, one that could fill the void he left behind." I listened, my heart pounding as she continued. "But over the years, I realized that the void never really went away. I just covered it up. I buried it with our life, with the kids, with everything we built together. And for a while, it worked. I loved you, Jack. I still do. But as time went on, I started to feel like I had lost myself somewhere along the way, like I had never fully dealt with losing Roger. And when the kids left and it was just the two of us, it all came back." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "So you're saying you've been holding on to him all these years because you never really grieved? That's why you started writing to him again?" Helen nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes. I thought writing would help me cope, but instead, it made me realize how much of myself I had lost. I didn't just lose Roger. I lost the part of me that was with him. And when I started writing to him again, it was like I found that part of myself. But it also made me realize how much I've been living in the past." The words hit me hard. I hadn't expected this. I had braced myself for more talk of love for Roger, for an explanation that would make me feel even more distant from her. But hearing her say that she had lost herself, that she had been living in the past, made me see things differently. "So where does that leave us?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "Where do I fit into all of this?" Helen wiped her eyes, looking at me with a sadness that felt unbearable. "That's what I don't know, Jack. I love you. I've always loved you. But I don't know if I've ever fully let go of who I was with Roger. And I don't know how to move forward with you if I'm still holding on to that." Her honesty stung, but it was what I'd been asking for. I could see the pain in her eyes, and for the first time I realized that this wasn't just about me being betrayed. It was about Helen struggling with her own identity, with her past, and with the life she'd built around it. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Helen, I don't want to be in a marriage with 3 people. I can't be in a marriage where part of your heart belongs to someone who's not here anymore. You've got to figure out what you want, not just for us, but for yourself." She nodded slowly, her face etched with guilt. "I know, and I've been trying, Jack, but I feel so lost." The weight of her words pressed down on me. I didn't know how to fix this. I didn't even know if it could be fixed. But I couldn't ignore the fact that Helen was struggling with something deeper than I had realized. She wasn't just holding on to Roger. She was holding on to the version of herself that existed when she was with him, and I wasn't sure if she was ready to let that go. "I think we need some space," I said after a long pause. "You need to figure out what you really want, and I need time to process all of this." Helen's face crumpled, but she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I understand. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the only one we could make. We'd been living in a fragile state of denial for years, and now that the truth was out, we needed to confront it head on." But that couldn't happen while we were under the same roof, with the weight of unspoken expectations hanging over us. I'll stay at a hotel for a few days, I said, standing up. We can figure out the details later. Helen didn't argue. She just watched me, her eyes filled with tears as I grabbed a small bag and headed for the door. As I reached the threshold, I stopped, turning back to look at her. Helen, I said quietly, I'm not giving up on us, but I need to know that you're willing to fight for us too. She looked up at me, her voice breaking as she replied, I am, Jack. I need to find myself again. I nodded, and without another word, I left the house. As I drove to the hotel, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Part of me felt like I was walking away from everything we had built, but another part of me knew that this was the only way we could even begin to repair the damage. We couldn't keep pretending things were fine, and we couldn't ignore the cracks that had been there for years. The next few days were a blur. I spent most of my time at the hotel, going through the motions of life but feeling like I was on autopilot. I talked to Linda a few more times, and each conversation helped me put things into perspective. She reminded me that sometimes you have to take a step back to move forward, and that space didn't mean the end. It just meant finding clarity. But clarity wasn't coming as easily as I'd hoped. Each night, I lay in bed, wondering if Helen and I could ever get back to what we once were, or if we even wanted to. Was it possible to rebuild a marriage after so many years of living in the shadow of someone else's ghost? The answer wasn't clear yet, but I knew one thing for certain. If we were going to find a way back to each other, it was going to take more than love. It was going to take a reckoning with the past and with the people we had become. The days I spent away from Helen gave me more time to think than I'd had in years. I wandered the hotel room, staring out the window at a life that felt like it was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't quite define. I wanted to believe that what Helen and I had was still salvageable, but every time I thought about her confession, her lingering love for Roger, I couldn't help but feel like I was fighting a losing battle. I couldn't be him. I'd never be him. But the truth was, I didn't want to be. I wanted Helen to love me for the man I had been for the past 32 years, the man who had stood by her through thick and thin, through raising kids, and through all the small, quiet moments that made up a lifetime together. Not the ghost of someone who had been frozen in time. In her memory. The second night in the hotel, I called Linda again. I didn't have many people I could talk to about this, but Linda had always been the one who could give me perspective. She listened as I poured out my frustrations, my confusion, and my fears about whether Helen and I could ever truly find our way back to each other. Do you think people can come back from something like this? I asked her, my voice heavy with doubt. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Linda answered. I think people can come back from a lot of things, but they both have to want it, Jack. This isn't just about forgiving her or moving past what she did. It's about her figuring out who she is now. And it sounds like she's been lost for a long time. Her words stung, but they were true. Helen had been lost in her grief, in her memories of Roger, in the life she thought she was supposed to have. And now that everything was out in the open, we were both standing in the wreckage, trying to figure out what came next. What if she can't find her way back? I asked quietly, my chest tightening at the thought. Then you'll have to decide if you can live with that, Linda said gently. But I don't think you're there yet. She's hurting, Jack. And maybe for the first time, she's realizing how deep that hurt goes. Give her time. Give yourself time. Time. That was the one thing we couldn't rush, and as much as I hated the uncertainty of it, I knew Linda was right. We couldn't rush through this. I needed to give Helen the space to figure out what she wanted, and I needed to figure out what I was willing to accept. The next few days passed in a blur of routine. I went for walks, sat in the hotel lobby with a cup of coffee that never tasted as good as the one Helen made at home, and tried not to think about what might be happening at the house. Was Helen doing the same? Was she sitting in that empty kitchen, staring at the walls, trying to figure out where everything had gone wrong? On the fourth day, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I needed to know where we stood. I called Helen, my hand shaking as I held the phone to my ear, waiting for her to pick up. Jack, she answered, her voice soft, almost fragile. Hey, I said, my voice cracking just a little. We need to talk. There was a pause, and then she said, yeah, we do. We agreed to meet at the house that evening, and as I drove back to the place that had been my home for so long, I felt a strange mixture of anxiety and hope. Part of me was terrified of what Helen might say, of what decisions might be made, but another part of me felt like this conversation was the beginning of something new. Whether it was the start of healing or the start of moving on, I wasn't sure yet. When I walked through the front door, the house felt eerily quiet. Helen was sitting at the kitchen table, the same place where we had had so many of our best and worst conversations. She looked up when I walked in, and for a moment neither of us said anything. I sat down across from her, my heart pounding in my chest. "So," I said, my voice rough, "where do we go from here?" Helen sighed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Jack, I've been doing a lot of thinking since you left, and I realized that I've been living in a state of denial for years. I've been holding on to Roger because I was afraid to let go of the past. I was afraid that if I let go of him, I'd lose a part of myself." I listened, my throat tight. This was what I had been waiting to hear, the truth in all its messy, painful complexity. But in holding on to him, I lost something else. Helen continued, her voice breaking. "I lost us. I lost the life we built together. And I'm so sorry, Jack. I can't change what I did, and I don't know if I can ever make it right. But I want to try. I want to find my way back, not just to you, but to me. The me that I was supposed to be, the one who didn't spend half her life trapped in the past." Her words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a lump rising in my throat. This was the first time in all these years that Helen had acknowledged how much she had been holding back, how much of herself had been locked away in the past. And while I knew it wouldn't be easy, hearing her say that she wanted to find her way back, to herself and to us, gave me hope. "I don't want to lose you, Helen," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But I can't be in a marriage where I'm competing with a memory. I need to know that you're committed to us, not just to fixing what's broken, but to us moving forward." Helen nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. And I want that too. I'm not going to pretend it's going to be easy, but I want to try. I want to figure out who I am now, and I want to do it with you. If you'll have me." We sat there in silence for a long time, both of us processing the gravity of what was being said. This wasn't a magical fix. There were no promises that everything would go back to the way it was. But it was a start, a commitment to move forward, together, in whatever way we could. "I'm willing to try," I said finally, my voice steady. "But we need help, real help. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. We can't do this alone." Helen nodded, her relief palpable. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I'm not going to let us fall apart, Jack. Not anymore." As we sat there, the weight of everything that had happened still hanging between us, I realized that this was the beginning of a long road. There would be setbacks. There would be hard days. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were facing it together, instead of pulling in opposite directions. That night, I didn't go back to the hotel. We didn't have all the answers, and we didn't pretend to. But as we lay in bed, side by side, not touching, but connected in a way we hadn't been in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. We were going to rebuild. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be fast. But for the first time, I believed we could do it. The next few months were harder than I expected. Helen and I didn't just go back to our old routines as if nothing had happened. In fact, it felt like everything was under a microscope, our conversations, our interactions, even the smallest gestures. But there was also a sense of honesty between us that hadn't been there in years. We weren't skirting around uncomfortable topics anymore. Instead, we were facing them head on, no matter how painful they were. Counseling helped. I'd been skeptical at first. What could a therapist possibly tell us that we didn't already know? But those sessions forced us to dig deep, to ask the hard questions, and most importantly, to listen to each other in a way we hadn't in a long time. It wasn't just about the letters or Roger. It was about everything that had built up over the years. The resentment, the unresolved grief, the growing distance between us. There were times when I wanted to walk out, when the weight of all that had been left unsaid felt too heavy to bear. But each time we pushed through. One evening, after a particularly tough session, Helen and I sat on the porch watching the sunset. It had become our routine, sitting out there together, not always talking, but just being present. It felt like a small step toward something more. "Do you think we'll ever get back to where we were?" Helen asked quietly, her voice barely breaking the stillness of the evening. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "I don't think we're supposed to get back to where we were. I think we're supposed to figure out where we're going next." Helen looked at me, her expression thoughtful. "I like that, moving forward instead of looking back. That's the only way this works," I said. "We can't rebuild what's gone, but we can build something new." It was the truth. I had come to realize that holding on to the past, whether it was her past with Roger or our own, wasn't going to help us. We had to create a new version of us, one that acknowledged everything we had been through, but wasn't defined by it. We still had bad days. Some nights, Helen would retreat into herself, the weight of everything she had carried for so long catching up to her. There were times when I found myself angry again, frustrated that we were even in this situation in the first place. But the difference now was that we were talking about it, working through it instead of letting it fester. The biggest shift came when Helen decided to stop writing the letters. It was a quiet decision, not some grand declaration, but one day she told me, "I don't need them anymore." She explained that she had been writing to Roger not because she was still in love with him, but because she was trying to hold on to a part of herself that had been lost when he died. The letters had been her way of keeping that connection, of preserving who she was with him. But now she realized that she didn't need the letters to move forward. She needed to let go of that version of herself in order to fully embrace the life she had now, with me. I can't say it didn't sting a little, knowing that a part of her had been locked in the past for so long. But hearing her say that she was ready to let go of it for good, that was a moment of healing, not just for her, but for us. We kept going to counseling, even after things started to feel more settled. It became less about working through the immediate crisis and more about learning how to communicate better, how to be more open with each other. We talked about the future in ways we hadn't in years, about traveling once the grandkids were a little older, about what retirement might look like for us, about rediscovering who we were as a couple now that we weren't defined by raising kids or the ghosts of the past. One evening, as we sat in the kitchen after dinner, Helen looked at me with a soft smile. "Do you ever regret staying?" The question caught me off guard, but I didn't have to think long about the answer. "No," I said honestly. "I don't. We've been through hell, but we've come out the other side, and I think we're stronger for it." Helen's eyes glistened with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope. "I'm glad you didn't give up on us." "I'm glad you didn't either," I replied. We had come a long way since that night when everything had fallen apart. There were still scars, still memories that would never fully fade, but they didn't define us anymore. We were building something new, something better. And in the end, that's what I realized about love. It's not always about holding on to what you had. Sometimes it's about letting go of the things that weigh you down and choosing to build something different, something that's rooted in honesty, vulnerability, and a shared commitment to move forward. Helen and I weren't the same couple we had been 30 years ago, but in a way, that was a good thing. We were older, wiser, and more aware of our flaws and our strengths. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were truly partners, walking side by side into whatever came next. As we sat there together, the weight of the past finally lifting, I realized something important. We hadn't just survived. We had grown. And in the end, that was worth all the struggle.